American essayist, novelist, and playwright, whose eloquence and passion on the subject of race in America made him an important voice, particularly in the late 1950s and 1960s. I'm Tyrone Bowman. This is Tyrone Bowman Tonight. This evening topic of discussion, James Baldwin. If you're passing by and you are viewing this video, would you please hit like and subscribe? I would appreciate it very much. And if you like Tyrone Bowman Tonight, I hope that you will check out some of the other videos and things that we also have on here. There are about 70 plus videos already recorded. As an inspirational, motivational teacher, I'm endeavoring to bring to you the lives of prominent men and women who rose from obscurity into international and national prominence and made a difference in America and around the world. So hopefully what we're doing here will make a difference for you. This evening I'll be talking about James Baldwin. James Arthur Baldwin was born on the 2nd of August of 1924. He died the 1st of December of 1987. He was an American writer and activist. As a writer, he garnered acclaim across various mediums, including essays, novels, plays, and poems. His first novel, Go Tell It on the Mountain, was published in 1953. Decades later, Time magazine included the novel on its list of the 100 best English language novels released from 1923 to 2005. His essay collection, Notes of a Native Son, was published in 1955. Baldwin's work fictionizes fundamental personal questions and dilemmas amid complex social and psychological pressures. Themes of masculinity, sexuality, race, and class intertwine to create intricate narratives that run parallel with some of the major political movements toward social change in mid-20th century America, such as the Civil Rights Movement and the Gay Liberation Movement. Baldwin's protagonists are often but exclusively African American and gay and bisexual men, frequently feature prominently in his literature. These characters often face internal and external obstacles in their search for social and self-acceptance. Such dynamics are prominent in Baldwin's second novel, Giovanni's Room, which was written in 1956, well before the gay liberation movement. His reputation has endured silence since his death, and his work has been adapted for the screen to great acclaim. An unfinished manuscript, Remember This House, was expanded and adapted for cinema as the documentary film, I Am Not Your Negro, which came out in 2016, which was nominated for Best Documentary Feature at the 89th Academy Awards. One of his novels, If Beale Street Could Talk, was adapted into the Academy Award-winning film of the same name in 2018, directed and produced by Barry Jenkins. In addition to writing, Baldwin was also a well-known and controversial public figure and orator, especially during the civil rights movement in the United States. On a personal note, I'd like to say this about the late James Baldwin. He had more courage, more intestinal fortitude. He was extremely courageous than most individuals who pretend to be something that they're not. He stood at a time in America when others were silent on major relevant issues. His voice alone echoed around the world, and he will always be remembered as a champion, a hero, an activist, a liberator on all fronts of life. Now back to the script. James Arthur Baldwin was born to Emma Burdess Jones on August 2nd, 1924 at Harlem Hospital in New York City. Baldwin was born out of wedlock. Jones never revealed to Baldwin who his biological father was. According to Anna Malikia, Tubbs in her account of the mothers of prominent civil rights figures. Some rumors stated that Baldwin's father suffered from drug addiction or that he died, but that in any case, Jones undertook to care for her son as a single mother. A native of Deal Island, Maryland, where she was born in 1903, Emma Jones was one of the many who fled racial segregation in the South during the Great Migration. She arrived in Harlem at 19 years old. In 1927, Jones married David Baldwin, a laborer and Baptist preacher. David Baldwin was born in Bunkie, Louisiana, and preached in New Orleans, but left the South for Harlem in 1919. How David and Emma met is uncertain, but in James Baldwin's semi-autobiographical Go Tell It on the Mountain, the characters based on the two are introduced by the man's sister, who is a friend of the woman. Emma Baldwin would bear 8 children with her husband George, Barbara, Wilmer, David Jr., named for James's father, and deceased half-brother, Gloria, Ruth, Elizabeth, and Paula, and raised them with her eldest, James, who took his stepfather's last name. James rarely wrote or spoke of his mother. When he did, he made clear that he admired and loved her, often through reference to her loving smile. Baldwin moved several times in his early life, but always to different addresses in Harlem. Harlem was still a mixed-race area of the city in the incipient days of the Great Migration. Tenement and penury featured equally throughout the urban landscape. David Baldwin was many years Emma's senior. He may have been born before emancipation in 1863. Although James did not know exactly how old his stepfather was, David's mother Barbara was born enslaved and lived with the Baldwins in New York before her death when James was 7. David also had a light-skinned half-brother that his mother's erstwhile slave master had fathered on her, and a sister named Barbara, who James and others in the family called Tunti. David's father and James's paternal grandfather had also been born enslaved. David had been married earlier, begetting a daughter who was old as Emma when the two were wed, and at least 2 sons, David, who would die in jail, and Sam, who was 8 years James's junior, lived with the Baldwins in New York for a time and once saved James from drowning. James referred to his stepfather simply as his father throughout his life, but David Sr. and James shared an extremely difficult relationship, nearly raising to physical fights on several occasions. They fought because James read books, because he liked movies, because he had white friends, all of which David Baldwin thought threatened James's salvation. Baldwin's biographer, David Adams Leeming, wrote, David Baldwin also hated white people, and his devotion to God was mixed with a hope that God would take revenge on them for him. Wrote another Baldwin biographer, James Campbell. During the 1920s and 1930s, David worked at a soft drinks bottling factory. Though he was eventually laid off from his job, and as his anger entered his sermons, he became less in demand as a preacher. David Baldwin sometimes took his anger out on his family, and the children became fearful of him. Tensions to some degree balanced by the love lavished on them by their mother. Let me say this to you preachers, and you're not going to like this, but it has to be said. Stop taking your personal convictions and imposing them upon your children. Let them live their lives, and you love them because they're your children, not because you are thunderously preaching hellfire and brimstone into their lives, thinking that you're helping them. You're only hurting them and further dividing what would be a wonderful, loving relationship. As for me, I love my children for who they are, and I accept them for who they are, not for what I want them to become. Whatever they decide to do, to be, and to have in this life, they'll always have my unconditional love. And I hope some of them are watching tonight. All right, once again, now back to the script. David Baldwin grew paranoid near the end of his life. He was committed to a mental asylum in 1943 and died of tuberculosis on July 29 of that year, the same day Emma gave birth to their last child, Paula. James Baldwin, at his mother's urging, had visited his dying stepfather the day before and came to something of a posthumous reconciliation with him in his essay, Notes of a Native Son, in which he wrote, in his outrageously demanding and provocative way, he loved his children, who were black like him and minutes like him. David Baldwin's funeral was held on James's 19th birthday, around the same time that the Harlem riot broke out. As the oldest child, James worked part-time from an early age to help support his family. He was molded not only by the difficult relationships in his household, but by the results of poverty and discrimination he saw all around him. As he grew up, friends he sat next to in church were turned away to drugs, crime, or prostitution, in what Tubbs found not only a commentary on his own life, but on the black experience in America. Baldwin once wrote, I never had a childhood. I did not have any human identity. I was born dead. Baldwin wrote comparatively little about events at school. At 5 years old, Baldwin began school at Public School 24 on 108th Street in Harlem. On 128th Street in Harlem. The principal of the school was Gertrude E. Ayer, the first black principal in the city, who recognized Baldwin's prolificity and encouraged him in his research and writing pursuits, as did some of his teachers who recognized he had a brilliant mind. Ayer stated that James Baldwin got his writing talent from his mother, whose notes to school were greatly admired by the teachers, and that her son also learned to write like an angel, albeit an avenging one. By 5th grade, not yet a teenager, Baldwin had read some of Fyodor Dostoevsky's works, Harriet Beecher Stowe's Uncle Tom's Cabin, and Charles Dickens' A Tale of Two Cities. Beginning a lifelong interest in Dickens' work, Baldwin wrote a song that earned New York Mayor Fiorello LaGuardia praise in a letter that LaGuardia sent to Baldwin. I probably messed that name up. Baldwin also wrote a prize for a short story that was published in a church newspaper. Baldwin's teachers recommended that he go to a public library on 135th Street in Harlem, a place that would become a sanctuary for Baldwin, and where he would make a deathbed request for his papers and effects to be deposited. It was at PS24 that Baldwin met Orilla Bill Miller, a young white school teacher from the Midwest whom Baldwin named as partially the reason that he never really managed to hate white people. Among other outings, Miller took Baldwin to see an all-black rendition of Orson Welles' Take on Macbeth in Lafayette Theater, from which followed a lifelong desire to succeed as a playwright. David was reluctant to let his stepson go to the theater. He saw stage works as sinful and was suspicious of Miller, but his wife insisted, reminding him of the importance of Baldwin's education. Miller later directed the first play that Baldwin ever wrote. At PS24, Baldwin entered Harlem's Frederick Douglass Junior High School. At Douglass Junior High School, Baldwin met two important influences. The first was Harmon W. Pill Porter, a black Harvard graduate. Porter was the faculty advisor to the school newspaper, the Douglass Pilot, where Baldwin would later be the editor. He would be the editor. Porter took Baldwin to the library on 42nd Street to research a piece that would turn into Baldwin's first published essay titled Harlem, Then and Now, which appeared in the autumn 1937 edition of Douglass's Pilot. The second of these influences from his time at Douglass was the renowned poet of the Harlem Renaissance, Countee Cullen. Cullen taught French and was a literary advisor in the English department. Baldwin later remarked that he adored Cullen's poetry and said he found the spark of his dream to live in France in Cullen's early impression on him. Baldwin graduated from Frederick Douglass Junior High in 1938. Now, this is going to be one of two parts. In 1938, Baldwin applied to and was accepted at DeWitt Clinton High School in the Bronx, a predominantly white, predominantly Jewish school, matriculating there that fall. At DeWitt Clinton, Baldwin worked on the school's magazine, The Magpie, with Richardson Avedon, who went on to become a noted photographer, and Emile Copaya, and Solstein, who both would become renowned publishers. Baldwin did interviews and editing at the magazine and published a number of poems and other writings. Baldwin finished at DeWitt Clinton in 1941. His yearbook listed his ambition as novelist, playwright. Baldwin's motto in his yearbook was "Fame is the spur and ouch." During his high school years, uncomfortable with the fact that, unlike many of his peers, he was becoming more sexually interested in males than in females, Baldwin sought refuge in religion. He first joined the now demolished Mount Calvary of the Pentecostal Faith Church on Lenox Avenue in 1937, but followed the preacher there, Bishop Rose Artemius Horn, who was affectionately called Mother Horn. When she left to preach at Fireside Pentecostal Assembly at 14, Brother Baldwin, as Baldwin was called, first took to Fireside's altar. It was at Fireside Pentecostal, during his most extemporaneous sermons, that Baldwin learned that he had authority as a speaker and could do things with the crowd, says biographer Campbell. Baldwin delivered his first sermon at Fireside Pentecostal in 1941. Baldwin later wrote in the essay Down at the Cross that the church was a mask for self-hatred and despair. Salvation stopped at the church door. He related that he had a rare conversation with David Baldwin in which they had really spoken to one another, with his stepfather asking, "You'd rather write than preach, wouldn't you?" This is to be continued. Until next time, remember, James Baldwin, champion, hero, activist. Never surrender, never quit.